Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you. Have exciting things to talk about today. I think exciting anyways. Hopefully you will too. So we just finished up with text and travail. And I know we kind of went off a little sidetrack with that for a little bit, but I felt it was necessary to show kind of where my mind is right now, or what I'm thinking or reading about, because I think it kind of gives us a little broader picture. So text and travail I thought was pretty good. That was fun to look at. I hope you got something out of that. As far as going off on the sides, I don't know if we'll do that today or not, but I think, there's a friend of mine, we used to go hiking a lot, backpack trips. We would do, 20 to 25 mile hikes. They were pretty nice. But some places you would go, the main trail, after a while, it would be boring because there was nothing to see. You had to take one of the little side trails off to get to what you want to see. On the east side of Letchworth, it's like that. It's not a park like the west side. It's just trails through the woods. And there's a couple of them where if you take the little side trail off, you get to walk right up to the edge of the gorge, and it's beautiful. And so there's different things to see. And I kind of think, studying the Bible is kind of like that, right? You read and you read and you read and you read the same things all the time, but it's not until you find something someone else said about what you're reading, and then you kind of follow off where they got their ideas, all of a sudden you find all this really cool stuff. And so we won't be afraid to do that. Today, the title, A Grand Polyphony, One Story, Two Revelations, and Four Voices, is a quote from Mr. Jerzak's book, the start of his chapter number 14. If you have his book and you're reading along, you can read in that chapter and get some of the things, probably most of the things that we're going to talk about with some of my own stuff and stuff from other people pointed in. But I'm supposed to be reading a quote right now, and you know what? I can't because I didn't bring my book with me. My note says, read N.T. Wright quote from page 193. I can summarize the quote. The quote is that you have the scriptures and you can read all kinds of things in the Old Testament and in the Bible about God. And we can perceive from all these things, well, God is like this and God is like that. But Mr. Wright says that we should not dare attribute anything to God without looking at Jesus. Because Jesus is who God is, right? And Jesus told us that. If you want to turn to John chapter 14, we'll read that. And I think it'll be a good starting place for us today. Now, this morning, so your fingers are getting a little exercise right now, but the rest of the time this morning, there's not really going to be any Bible turning. We're just going to do kind of an introduction into what this is about. But if we read verses 9 through 11, it says, and of course here people are trying to figure out who Jesus is. He says, others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the one. So they were saying to him, how then were your eyes opened? I'm in the completely wrong place. We're going to John chapter 14. Thank you. And we're reading in verse 9 through 11. I started reading that and I thought, this doesn't sound familiar. Jesus said to him, have I been so long with you, and yet you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has sent me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak of my own initiative, but the Father abiding in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Otherwise, believe because of the works themselves. So someone asked Jesus, I want to see the Father. Can't you show him to us? And Jesus is saying, yeah, but you're looking at him right now. When Jesus says the Father is me and I am in him, he's not saying the ideas of the Father are in me and I am me, and the ideas of me are in the Father. He's saying literally, I am Father walking among you in the flesh. And everything that I do and I say are of God. And he says, in him, the Father is doing his works. So all the works that Jesus did, everything he talked about, that's God talking. And so that's what Mr. Wright is talking about. There's nothing that we should assume about God, even if we read it from the scriptures, nothing we should assume about him should we say, this is God, unless we can take it and compare it to Jesus Christ and what God did in Jesus, because God is saying, this is who I am. It's interesting, in the book of John, I looked up the word Father, and it's got 1/3 of all references to the Father are in the book of John, which is kind of neat. There's a little study in itself. A lot of the others in, let's say Matthew, for example, probably close to half of Matthew's references to the Father, or Father, the word Father, are in the genealogies or other stories. In John, it's Father almost always is in reference to God, the Father. So I found that pretty interesting. I didn't write it down, but I think it's 100 and some times in John and about 300 times in the rest of the New Testament. So that's kind of neat stuff to look at. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our message today. Lord, we're thankful that we can join each other here in getting to know you, which is worshiping you, knowing who you are, and learning things about the scriptures and the Bible that we have, which we are very thankful for. We're thankful for all those who are with us, even not in person. We're thankful for contributions that are made to our ministry. We're very thankful that we are in a position where we can share these things with folks, and that there are folks that are interested in hearing. And Lord, I pray that those people would also share things if they believe them. Lord, I pray that everyone would not just take what I'm saying or the folks that I'm reading and what they're saying, but that people would truly study for themselves and get to know you for themselves, and find out if it's what they believe. Pray these things in your Son's name, amen. One thing that Jesus did tell Philip was, if you don't believe that I am the manifestation of the Father to you, at least believe in me because of the works you've seen. Isn't that interesting? So he's telling him, I'm not requiring you to believe that I'm the Father. I'm just saying, can't you see it? But if you don't believe it, at least believe that something miraculous here is happening because of what you've been seeing, and that there's something going on. It's kind of like an invitation into, but not requiring that you actually, in the end, necessarily come to the belief at that point, right? I think that's kind of neat. So anyways, if you're reading along with me in Mr. Jerzak's book, we're going to start reviewing chapter 14. Chapter 14 is really neat, and it's about a polyphony or polyphonic variety of voices. So by polyphony, he's saying the sound of voices are many and varied. So in the Old Testament, you're going to read all kinds of from different people, different walks of life, who have different things to say and different experiences, and they're giving their experiences. So, in Jesus' day, they had the what we call the Old Testament. Plus, they had the Apocrypha and some other writings, but they had that. Those were in the temple. So the way that you heard it was you went to the synagogue, your local synagogue, and the priest, or someone who's not a priest, as we see Jesus and others probably also, would be able to open scrolls and read it. And then we learned at one time that they would give a commentary of what they thought it meant, and there were even commentaries written out for them that they could use to read and see what it meant. But that, for them to understand who God was, that's what they had. They had the Bible. It's interesting, if you read some of the things that were written in the between the Testaments, some things already pointed to some of the stuff we're talking about. So there were Jewish men, rabbis, who didn't necessarily believe that everything in the Old Testament about God was exactly about God. Some believed it. So you had a variety of ideas. And it's interesting, too, in Jesus' time, if you think about Paul and the philosophers and everything, there was a wide variety of thought at that time regarding God, or the gods as well. And nobody pushed that aside, right? They wanted Paul to come back so they could hear more, and so they could debate between each other and learn from each other. So that was encouraged, even by some who were part of the Jewish religious system. So they had Jesus to show them, and that's what we just read. But at that time, they didn't know. They didn't understand that. We could see that through Philip. It wasn't really, they maybe couldn't wrap their minds around it yet, or just wasn't revealed to them yet. Then, over time, there started to become letters, like Matthew and Paul's letters, and those were shared among people. And so they had those things, but they didn't think of that as the scriptures. They were letters from a guy that they thought was a prophet or an apostle or a disciple. At some point, people put all these things together. At somewhere along the line, as they were reading all these things and maybe starting to compile some of them, people started to realize there is a disparity between God from Genesis to Malachi and the God that all you guys are talking about, the letters that we're getting. There's something different here. You're saying that Jesus said this about himself, and he said this about something in the Old Testament, and a lot of people heard him say those things. Then why is it that these things are there? So people began to question. So it wasn't, some people will look at what people are writing about today and people are talking about today, and they'll think, well, this is all just new stuff, right? A lot of the people who debate it will say that, these new doctrines or new theologies, stay away from them, because tradition teaches us. Well, the problem is that the tradition that's teaching them wasn't from Jesus' day or Paul's day, or even the first couple centuries after that. It wasn't until 400, 500, 600 years after that people like Augustine came along and started to root some of the traditions that were grabbed onto, and even people beyond that. So in the early times, things like this were talked about and questioned. So Mr. Jurczak has three groups he brings out. One is Gnostics. So the Gnostics weren't new. The Gnostics were around the time of Paul, and probably before that. I don't know the history of them, but they had a lot of interesting things to say about the scriptures. One of the things was that one of their answers was, Well, all of the things that happened in the Old Testament were things that were done by emanations that were from God. So there's God, and then God is sending out beings or emanations to try to get to creation to say who he is, but the further away from him they get, they lose the message, or the less like him they are. They even believe that Yahweh was one of the prime emanations from God, that Yahweh wasn't God. So all of the violence and everything in the Old Testament that could be attributed to Yahweh or to God, to them, that wasn't God, that was an emanation. And so it was losing its translation to who God was. So they thought there were distortions. The Martianites, who followed a man named Marcion, he believed that the Old Testament was unworthy of being part of the Bible because of those things. Because he would read what Jesus said, and then what he read there, and he said, well, it's not the same. So they just didn't use the Old Testament. I don't know if that's still a group today or not, but it was for a very long time, I know that. He talks about Eastern Orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy takes, they don't say those things didn't happen, but they take, yes ma'am, I'm sorry.
Say that again.
Marcionite.
No.
What was it? Eastern Orthodoxy.
Eastern.
Yes. So Eastern Orthodoxy takes much of it spiritually or allegorically. So it's not that they don't believe that those things, they believe those things happened, but they believe that the application for us is different, and that we're to see God in a different way, and so they spiritualize such texts. They think that perhaps these are figurative representations even of real spiritual battles. So when Israel was fighting the Philistines in the heavens, God was fighting some Satan or some demons, and it was being manifest here so that people could understand that these things were going on. So they have a lot of interesting things about it. Those are just the three groups that he gave. I'm sure there's other people that had different thoughts at that time. Certainly the disciples had different thoughts, and Paul probably had different thoughts. We can read that from what we read of the things that they said or talked about. So the next thing, this actually happened before Orthodoxy and before the Martianites, is the Holy Roman Empire. So at one time in Rome's history, there was a new emperor, Constantine, and he was said to have adopted Christianity, and he made the Roman Empire a Christian empire. But what happened with before him, Christians would not take part in battles. So a Christian could be conscripted into the Roman military, but most of the ones that were conscripted would be like today, conscientious objectors. They would be medics, or serving food, or be the servant of a centurion or something like that. In the Romans, I have read from a couple different writings from generals, through other people, of course, reading their books, they had great respect for that. Because here are people who are so grounded in their beliefs that they won't do something, but they will obey and serve us. Other groups who said they might not have believed in those things, they conscripted, and they were able to get them just to do anything. So they had a lot of respect for that already. And many people in the Roman military who were involved with Christians would become Christians themselves because of the testimony of these Christians, which is pretty neat to read about that. But when Constantine comes and he makes Rome into a Christian empire, the empire doesn't stop being an empire. They use Christianity as a tool to the empire. So the Christian empire didn't adopt the practices of the Christians who joined before that and wouldn't take part in battle. They used used Christianity to justify battles, and they did that mostly using the Old Testament. And not surprisingly, the mass of people in the Roman Empire, of course, went along with it, right? They all became Christian because they had to, because that was the new religion of the empire, but they weren't really practicing what Christianity was. And so that grew. So they used the Bible often to justify war and violence. Augustine comes along and he even writes a document called A Just War. So he uses the scripture and says, this is what you can do to go to war and make it just. But his didn't go as far as even the Roman Empire carried it. His was pretty limited in what he thought that you could have a war over. So things like that continue. There have been many groups of people since then who have advocated for nonviolence. But unfortunately, they have been in a very small minority. As we can see through world history, how the governments have carried out what goes on around the globe with war and violence. And some of those groups are the Anabaptists, who would be where the Mennonites and Amish came from. The Anabaptists of Germany were staunchly nonviolent, and so are Mennonites and Amish. So some of those things come from them. In fact, if you read Greg Boyd et al., many times he will say that probably if he was to term himself as something, it would probably be an Anabaptist. Which is interesting. The Quakers were another one. And interesting to me that Brad mentioned Quakers because, I often try to sit down and think, because I've read that this is important. I don't know how important, but I try to think of when did this start in my mind? And I can't think about it. But one thing I thought about, and I completely forgot about it, was the Quakers. Remember, I used to have a little Geo Prism, just a great little car, and it was loaded with bumper stickers. Some of the bumper stickers on it were from an organization that's Quaker. And the Quakers have a big lobbying group in Washington, D.C., and they lobby for many things, but one of the things that they lobby for is anti-war, which is interesting. So maybe some of it started there, I don't know. But humanity has always found a way, even Christianity. You think about the Spanish Inquisition, you could think about the Crusades, you could think about anything. Even recent wars, Christians have found reasons to justify violence in war. And it really has been a non-issue. Don't think about the peace people who went on big strikes and everything else, because that's not Christian, although they were for peace. Christianity, in looking at peace or nonviolence, has been a non-issue until, again, recent years. It was an issue for Christians in the early days after Jesus in the Roman Empire. And then once the empire became Christian, that thought kind of slowly faded away because the government now was Christian and they were saying what Christian was. So it changed. But until recently, people like the Anabaptists and the Quakers and others were a very small minority. And even other people that I've read some books by from these time frames, they're in a minority. It's been a non-issue. But recently, there's been a change. And what has caused this change? What is causing people like Brad and others to spend time and effort writing books and go around the country on speaking tours and doing all these things and talking about these things about the Bible? One reason is because many young Christians, and we can hear about this. I get a magazine, Christianity Today, and it talks about a lot of these issues and reasons why Christianity is shrinking and churches are getting smaller and people are leaving. Much of it is because young people. Many young people have questions about these disparities between the testaments or between the actions of the church or the church leaders and what Jesus said. And what are they told? You can imagine what they're told. Shh, don't question. We have faith. It is what it is. That's it. We don't question. So there aren't any answers. And for so long, honestly, if a preacher was asked or someone, he sat down with a young person, the young person wouldn't get an answer because the pastor didn't have an answer. Because they didn't look at these things because they've been looking at the traditions. And so these people feel that they have been put aside or trivialized, and so they have decided to walk away, right? Not all of them. Most of them are doing that, but not all of them, thankfully. Also, Christians in general nowadays don't read their Bibles. I think it's probably been like that for decades, but less and less and less do Christians actually read the Bible. So when they're asked questions like this, they don't know because they might even know something was in the Bible that they're asked about. They only follow what the leaders say. A third reason given is that leaders have become very political and mix desires of their political parties or the state with the Bible, kind of like the Holy Roman Empire. And so then people who would come to church don't come to church because they feel alienated, so they don't come. Another reason is atheism has evolved. Atheists now are biblical experts. Many atheists know more about the Bible than the average Christian because most atheists today, the new atheists they call them, used to be Christians. And they're the ones that were reading and studying and had questions. And when they couldn't find the answer, people told them just to be quiet. And they said, no, I can't do that. So they just decide there can't be a God. In fact, many new atheists still believe in a God. They just don't believe in the God of the Bible or God that Christianity. So they just kind of put it out to like a mysterious thing. But because of that, when Christians do try to stand up against them, they are easily debated and squashed because the atheists know way more than they do about the Bible. And so that turns people away. I think, some of the things I think, Christians are afraid to think. They're afraid to question because of the first thing that we read. They've learned something all their lives and they think that's it. And so every question they have, they can take that answer from something they learned all their lives, and things that are out there, they won't apply because they think, well, that's not what I learned. So they just put it away. When really, being a Christian should be an ever-evolving thing. We learned that last Wednesday, right? It's continual. You're constantly learning more about who your God is, hopefully. So I think that some are afraid to question because they're literally afraid of God. They think if I question too much, God is going to break me. And I'm going to have some big tribulation. I'm not going to be able to get through it. I'm going to lose my job or something will happen. Because they're afraid of God. And they're afraid of that because that's what tradition has taught them. Right? Be afraid. This is what it is. So all these things have come down. I also think in my mind that how could all of this been going on for hundreds of years, right? And then all of a sudden it starts to sway. Sometimes in my mind, I think, we say the Spirit works in us. God might be having a hand in some of this, saying, kind of like, hey, not saying that it's scripture, but somebody has a question and they're not afraid to look and they start praying about it and they start examining it and they start learning something. We learn more when we're praying and we're in touch because Paul says the Spirit works in us. And so there might be possible, not saying that's the case, but there could be something of God's hand in that. Of course, 20 years from now it could change and all fall apart, and then you could say, Dan said God had a hand in it. Well, how could that be if it doesn't happen anymore? So I'm not saying that is the case, but something has definitely happened. One of the things he talks about, which I find is really neat, is worship services. Think about all the songs that we sing now by all these new Christian groups, right? And it is pretty new, really. Because before worship services, there was singing a couple hymns from the traditional hymns, and then you had your service. Now they have these hour-long concerts, and they worship God through song, kind of like Israel did. We learned about that in the Psalms once, right? With cymbals and drums and loud noises and music. So it's like that. But read the lyrics of all of these songs. I read lyrics of some of these people and I think, wow, I wonder if they're a universalist. Even though the churches that they go to or they worship in aren't, but the lyrics certainly point to that. Because he brings out something that I've never thought of before, is that worship should precede theology. Israel's conception of God was born out in their music and their song and things they sang. That's what people thought about God. And so if we have people writing songs and we're writing what we're really thinking. We're not writing based on the words we read in the Bible. We're writing, well, it is based in the Bible ultimately, but we're writing, well, wait a minute, this is what Jesus said about God, I'm writing about it. And so then they sing it, and that's what people think. So I find that is kind of an interesting point too. So he says maybe good theology is a theology that defines and analyzes what the worshipers are saying, then goes to the Bible, and then brings out, this is what it is, instead of trying to define what it is for the worshipers. Because what's a theologist? A theologist is a worshiper, really, trying to learn more about God and telling people about it. So in the Bible, a polyphony of voices. There's a variety of voices in the Bible. You have to think of the Bible, the whole thing, as one long story. Can't chop it up. Can chop up a little bit because we know Jesus came, he died on the cross, he rose, and things changed. But that's part of a greater story. And so the whole Bible is a narrative. It is a journey of people of faith. People who had enough faith to listen to God, prophets or others, like David. They loved God, and they worshiped him, and they sought after him, and God imparted things to them, and they thought enough about it, and were prompted by him probably to write it down. And so they wrote it down, their experiences with God, or what they felt God was. So it's a journey. At the beginning of a journey, you don't know everything. You might know where you're going, but along the way, you see all kinds of cool things, right? So if you're taking a trip, across the country to see the Grand Canyon, and you decide to take the scenic route, and you go through all these little towns, and you say, oh, look at that antique shop. Oh, look at this cool thing. Oh, look at this park. Let's have lunch here. And then you learn something about the history of the area. You learn things along the way. It's a journey. You don't know everything. So you can't look and say, this is who God is, and then take everything and under the Bible and put it underneath that. It's a journey along the way. People are learning. So these people believed largely in a God that they couldn't see. Now, God early on manifested himself to them in different ways, right? And so they could see God did that. The pillar of fire, going through the Red Sea, different things that God did for them. But as time went on, as they worshiped God less and started going after other nations, a lot of that kind of starts falling by the wayside, because not just on God's part, but on their part, because their journey of faith is starting to kind of wane, and they're starting to become like everybody else and doing everything everybody else says. And so the relationship is drifting until a point where God has to put a stop to it because of what they were called to be. So they're following God, and the people that were still following him, even though they talked to him and they prayed and they had visions and with some people, and then they portrayed that to the people, largely it was for someone that they didn't see. So it was truly a great faith. Of course, we don't see God either. Well, we say we don't see God, but we should see God, right? If Christians were being Christians like they're supposed to, we would be able to say, that's in songs too, right? I've read lyrics like this in songs. I see Jesus in people. How do you see Jesus in people? Because every time someone does something that is Jesus-like, you should think in your mind, that's Jesus. That's the idea behind that. So we should be able to see God. We should also be able to see God in creation. So we don't have to worry that God doesn't come down and talk straight to us or give us visions. We are still a people of faith on a journey. So just like in our culture, you could find all kinds of Christian books by all times. Maybe someone used to be a lawyer and they retired, and they also had a theology degree or something as a minor, and so they start writing. And when they write, what's their style going to be like? Probably going to be lawyerly, because that's who they are. Even someone who has that kind of mindset is going to write according to that. So the different people we read from in the scriptures that wrote scriptures were different types of people with different minds and different thoughts. You can read that. If you just read the Old Testament, right? One is in one style, another's in a different style. Linguists can say Isaiah is really two different books. Well, there's first Isaiah and second Isaiah, and it's because the second Isaiah really wasn't the Isaiah we think was Isaiah. He was someone else who was like Isaiah, and so they called it Isaiah. Linguists can tell stuff like that, which is pretty amazing. But it was written by different people. So there were people who thought legally. There were liturgists, even though they wouldn't have called themselves liturgists, but they write like that. Poets, prophets, historians. Historians wrote Kings and Chronicles, or people who had the mind of history. There were politicians or kings. Think of David and Solomon. They were both kings, which is a politician. They wrote. So sometimes maybe what they wrote came from the mind of a king, and not from a mind of someone who was a subject. So they all lend their voices to the story from differing viewpoints, from their point of view. An Old Testament scholar named Walter Brueggemann says that the nature of Jewish scripture is to offer conflicting points of view and perspectives with no apologies. So it's all there in all its varying forms. And nobody in the Old Testament is saying, we're sorry, or we hope you can figure this out. It's just there. And that did not bother anyone, any Jewish folks. So it didn't bother a Pharisee, it didn't bother a Sadducee, it didn't bother someone writing commentary or reading from a scroll. It was there, and they knew enough to say, why is it here but not somewhere else? Or what happened here? Why is there a difference in the story? They just knew it was just someone else's version, and so we're going to read from it for what it is. So the question then that I've been asked by several people is, then how do I know any of this is true? It's true. It's all true, right? All of it is, I believe. It's true. There's a difference. The inerrantist, or someone who takes it absolutely literal, every single word, every letter, every punctuation mark, every verse break, everything, that's it, exactly, would say, it's true. And they would look at me and say, you don't think this is all true. There's no way you could think it's all true. It's just a definition of true. It's different, right? Some people will say, well, everybody's truth is different because what they believe is true is different from the next person. It doesn't mean actual facts, but in general ideas and how we think of things. So recognizing, at least I'm learning to recognize that there are many voices in the story. The historical or scientific facts of the story usually aren't gonna matter. I subscribe to a Biblical Archaeological Society magazine. I used to get the print magazine in the mail, but it's a little expensive, so I stopped, and I just get the emails. I also joined them on Facebook, so I get things. Archaeology can prove a lot of what happened in the Old Testament. But archaeology can also disprove some things in the Old Testament. And so an inerrantist would say, nothing can be disproved. There are tools of Satan. I've heard that before. They're tools of Satan, and they're sowing seeds of discord to get you to stop having faith. But, there are records of things. I learned that Israel they were good record keepers, but the way they kept records of things was grandiose, where other cultures were very fact-driven. So when a battle happened and Israel say it happened one way and the other people say it happened another way, archaeologists and others sometimes will kind of move off to the other culture because they knew that they were more fact-driven and not so grandiose. So there's things like that. There's a lot of neat stuff in Bible archaeology. I just, I'm almost done here for today, so just one little side note. But on Facebook yesterday, a guy posted who was a tour guide. And in Israel, his specialization is touring in the countryside of old artifacts and stuff. And he had this whole thing, and he was so excited about it. The way he talked about it just draws you into the video. Some guy in archaeology, the 30s or 40s, was trying to find Gilgal. And as it turns out, Gilgal wasn't really a city. Gilgal was a type of structure. And what he found was this circle with a little dovetail thing coming off of it. When they eventually found from the air, it was a footprint. That's what it looked like. Just the ball of a foot, not toes, ball of the foot and heel together. And they found these dotted all over the countryside of Israel. They're all over the place. They just have to uncover them. Some of them are still showing, like it might be grass or whatever, and then the stones they could see laid out. It turns out that ancient Jerusalem, was in this shape. And so they surmise that when God said, wherever your footprint is, that's yours, that's what I'm giving you, they had these structures that they built that signified the footprint. It was their footprint, or God's footprint. And so when they built ancient Jerusalem, it was built in that way, God's footprint. Now, they can't prove this, but it's something that they surmise based on why are all these things shaped like a footprint. It's pretty cool. So if you ever get a chance to look at that stuff, you should, because there's so much neat stuff that they find. And what does it bring you into? It takes you to how people back thought. Somebody in ancient Israel thought, God said footprint, let's build some things that are like a footprint, and that will be a form of worshiping God and thanking him. That's pretty cool, right? So more than just a Bible, they actually put it into structures. There's so much today. And that's why I get, when you talk about science, I talk with people who believe that, because Job mentioned snowflakes and creation, they think of the Bible as the Bible can explain all science. I don't think the Bible can explain much about science at all, because that's not its intent, right? So when we learn things about science and a scientist says, the Bible claims this, but no way that can't happen in science, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So the literal historical things that people can prove or disprove, they don't matter, because the Bible is a journey of faith. That's what it's about. One other thing that I'm going to add to this, that mostly because of someone I'm reading, Thomas J. Oord is a philosopher. He's a Christian. He used to work for, I can't even think of who they are now. I want to call them Wesleyans. They are Wesleyans, but they're a religious segment of Christianity belongs to that. And he kind of left because of things that he started to believe, and they didn't line up. But he was a philosopher teacher. So he still writes. Most of the books he writes are about love. That's like the big thing that he drives on. But he's a philosopher. And fundamentalism basically teaches philosophy is no good. No philosophy, because philosophy is mind or man-driven. But Mr. Ord says, everybody is a philosopher, because everybody has different ideas about life. That's philosophy. And a believer in God cannot help but take their experiences and things about life and form a philosophical opinion about their faith in God. In fact, as I thought about this, I thought, well, what about wisdom literature? You know, the Apocrypha has several wisdom books in it, aside from Proverbs and Psalms. Those are philosophical books, largely philosophical. And how can you say that? Well, how can things in Proverbs be exactly true? Because in Proverbs, if someone does something wrong, they're going to get caught, and they're going to go to jail. But that's not real life, right? It's thought. It's philosophy. A philosophy of life would say someone who does wrong things all their lives, eventually it's going to catch up to them. But it doesn't always happen that way. Maybe they're really rich and they're able to fend off everything, right? And their children are thankful, because then their children get all the money. It didn't get taken by the government. Hopefully their children will turn out to be good people from that. But it's philosophical in nature. And so some of it is abstract. David and Solomon, David, a great man of faith, even though he did despicable things in his life, like every human being, his just happened to be, some of them happen to be pretty bad. But a lot of what they wrote was philosophical in nature. And so then you still say, well, how can the Bible be true? Because it's true in that it's a journey of faith. So you read it all of it. So going forward then, we're going to be looking at Revelations, not the book of Revelations, but what does the Bible reveal? Through these voices, number one, it reveals the fallen state of humanity and its broken images of God. So humanity started at one place. Remember, after Seth was born, what does the Bible say? At this time, people began to worship God. That's what it says. So I read that now, and sometimes I wonder, well, does that mean that after Adam and Eve left the garden, they didn't worship God in between there? Maybe. Maybe they were pretty bitter. So they kind of didn't worship a lot. But they at least knew God. They walked with him, so they were able to share some of that. Well, at some point, people heard enough of that where as groups or as masses of people, they started to worship God. And then somewhere along the line from that, they fell and they fell and they fell and they fell until it became the mess that it was before the flood. And then after that, it kind of goes up again, right? Noah, they worship God, they do things the right way, and then it kind of falls away. And God says, well, let me call out somebody else. And he calls out Abram. Same thing happens. They worship God, they're close, and then they kind of slowly fall away. And so it is a story of a journey of faith from broken images of God. And the second part is that humanity becomes restored in Jesus, who incarnates the true image of God. So at some point in the history, God inserts himself and says, all right, here I am. This is who I am. So everything you thought about me from before, throw it away, because I'm telling you right now who I am. So if we're blessed then, right? Yeah. To be after Jesus and to be after the first hundreds of years or whatever, to finally see, wow, I can really see who God is. Far easier than any of them could. And so when we talk about the fallen state, sin is a part of that. But we're going to try to look beyond that and look at the fallen state as the images that were projected onto God. So man's condition became projected onto, well, this is what God is like. And so that's the first part. And so it truly becomes an issue where it is a story of a journey of people of faith. And so then it becomes our own journey. So now it becomes your journey, because now you're reading the scriptures and you're learning about the people that wrote the scriptures, and you're learning who they are and why they wrote and how they wrote. And now you have the benefit of seeing God in Jesus and looking back. And so you're slowly going on your own journey. I have a book at home by an Eastern Orthodox priest, and in his book is called "The Old Testament is About You." And I thought, well, what a cool title. And so he goes through and he reads, like, for instance, he reads through Jonah, and then he shows how Jonah is about me. And truly, Jonah could be about me in many instances. And so he's bringing out the fact that a lot of this is for you to use, because it described the human condition at that time, and it is similar to the human condition at this time. So it's about us. So it reveals the human condition, and Brad has little slides in there. And this one, the first one, the subheadings are, here is where the voices of sacrificial religion are heard, and humanity's need for retributive justice. And they projected that onto God. That comes after the revelation of the human condition. So just those two things. The second one is the revelation of the divine solution, which is God in Jesus, and God's solution to overcoming the human condition is the voice of self-giving love and offering restorative justice. Because there are points in the Old Testament where you can find restorative justice and God at work. And then when Jesus speaks, and when Paul speaks, as I've looked at over the past few months, hopefully you remember some of that, restorative justice is what God is interested in. So what we're not going to do is justify any text of violence. But we're also, unlike the Martianites, not going to throw them out. You read them. And you understand when you're reading it, God is trying to say something by giving me this whole book with two things that seem to vary. He's trying to say, hey, all of this that the people on the journey of faith that I chose are doing these things. I sent prophets to tell them what they're doing is wrong, and then I sent myself in my Son to show you who I am. And so the journey becomes, we learn from those things, and we move on. So we embrace them. We love the Bible. I love the Bible, even though a lot of those things are in there, because now I'm starting to realize what the Bible is for. It's here. I mean, you think about it. There's no other, if we call it the Jewish religious culture, there is no other culture that has handed down a book like this, or people, the volumes and volumes and volumes that have been written about this book. There is nothing else like that in the history of religion in the world. God made sure that that was happening so that we would have this. So eventually, hopefully, in our journeys of faith, we would learn who he is. And that's where we're going to end today. So you got about 10 minutes before we come back, and next week we will continue.